They say life is full of little moments, moments you don't think much about at the time, but that can end up changing everything. And sometimes, those moments sneak up on you in ways you never see coming. For me, it started with a knock on the door. It was an ordinary day, or so I thought. The sun was shining through the blinds, casting those faint, dusty rays across my living room. I remember I was folding laundry, Mark's shirts, my old sweater, just the usual. And then the doorbell rang. Just a simple, innocent sound, right? But if I had known then what I know now, I might have never answered it. Looking back, I can tell you this, I never meant for any of it to happen. You see, life wasn't perfect, but it was comfortable. My husband, Mark, and we've been together for 30 years. That's a lifetime, isn't it? Over time, though, it felt like we were just existing together. Like roommates more than husband and wife. He was always busy with work, coming home late, eating in silence, falling asleep in front of the TV. And me? I spent my days cleaning a house that felt too big, staring at walls that felt too quiet. I used to think I was fine with it. I told myself, this is just how marriage is after so many years. But the truth? Deep down, I felt invisible. Anyway, back to that knock. I opened the door, and there he was, this young guy, maybe in his early 20s, standing there with these big brown paper bags full of groceries. He had this easy smile, like he wasn't in a rush, like he genuinely cared about handing me those bags. And the way he looked at me, it wasn't in a flirty or inappropriate way, not at all. It was just kind, like I was someone worth noticing. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice warm and polite. And just like that, something shifted. I didn't even realize it at first, but there was this little spark, tiny, almost nothing. But when you've been walking around feeling like a ghost for years, even the smallest spark can light something inside you. I know what you're probably thinking. It's just a delivery. It's no big deal, right? That's what I told myself too. But that one interaction, that fleeting moment, was like a thread being pulled loose from an old sweater. And once you start pulling, you can't stop. What happened next, though? That's where everything changed. And believe me when I say this, it's a story you'll never forget. So stick around, because if you've ever felt lost, if you've ever felt unseen, this story might hit closer to home than you expect. And before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I promise you, there's so much more to uncover. For as long as I can remember, my life has followed the same routine. Wake up early, make coffee, and stand by the window while the world outside comes alive. I'd watch neighbors rushing off to work, kids riding their bikes, and the delivery trucks weaving through the streets. I always wondered if other people felt the same emptiness I did, or if it was just me. My husband, Mark, wasn't a bad man. In fact, most people thought he was a great guy. Hardworking, reliable, polite. But over the years, that reliability turned into distance. His days were swallowed by work, late meetings, and the occasional round of golf with his buddies. He'd come home, kiss my cheek out of habit, then disappear into his own world, a world that didn't seem to include me anymore. I didn't resent him, not really. But there were times I wished he'd look at me, really look at me, the way he used to when we were younger. I wished he'd notice the effort I put into keeping our home beautiful, or the way I still wore the perfume he said he loved on our wedding day. Instead, he'd glance past me, distracted, as if I were part of the furniture, always there, but never really seen. Our house was pristine, every corner spotless, every photo frame perfectly aligned. But it didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt more like a museum, cold, quiet, and filled with memories of what used to be. I tried to fill the silence with tasks, rearranging the bookshelves, tending to the garden, folding and refolding the same set of towels. But no matter how much I busied myself, the loneliness always crept back in. And then there was him, the delivery boy. His name was Ethan, though I didn't learn that until later. The first time he came, I barely noticed anything about him except his smile. But over the next few weeks, I started to look forward to his visits. Not in an obvious way, Nothing inappropriate, of course. It was just refreshing. Ethan had this way of speaking that made you feel like you mattered, even if it was just small talk. He'd ask how my day was going or comment on the weather, little things that no one else seemed to care about anymore. One time, he complimented the roses in my front yard. "You must have a green thumb," he said, handing me a bag of groceries with a grin. I laughed it off, but later that day, I found myself standing by the window, staring at those roses like they were the most beautiful thing in the world. It was harmless, I told myself. What was wrong with enjoying a bit of kindness? Ethan was young, probably around 22 or 23. He had this energy about him, carefree and unburdened by the weight of the world. He reminded me of the way Mark used to be when we first met, back when he'd surprise me with flowers or hold my hand in public just because he wanted to. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to notice little changes in myself. I'd catch myself checking the clock around the time Ethan usually arrived. I'd linger a little longer in front of the mirror, smoothing out my blouse or dabbing on a bit of lipstick. It wasn't that I was trying to impress him, at least, that's what I kept telling myself. It was just nice to feel like someone might notice. I don't think Ethan had any idea how much his visits meant to me. To him, I was probably just another customer, another stop on his route. But to me, he was a reminder of something I hadn't felt in years, being seen. And that feeling, it was intoxicating. One afternoon, I asked him about himself. It was the first time we'd talked for more than a minute or two. He told me he was working to save up for school, that he loved photography and hoped to travel someday. His eyes lit up when he spoke, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. He had so much life ahead of him, so many dreams. I used to have dreams like that too, once. After he left, I found myself sitting in the living room, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold. I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had been awakened, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. And that's when it hit me. It wasn't really about Ethan. It wasn't even about Mark. It was about me. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped living. I had let the spark inside me die out, convincing myself that this was just what life was supposed to be. But now, I wasn't so sure. I told myself to stop thinking about it, to push the feelings aside and focus on my marriage, my life, my responsibilities. But once that thread had been pulled, there was no going back. I didn't know it yet, but that knock on the door, the one that seemed so ordinary, was the start of something I couldn't control. Something that would change everything. It started innocently enough, like all things do. Another quiet Tuesday, the kind that blended into all the others. The afternoon light was pouring through the windows, casting soft golden streaks on the hardwood floors. I had spent the morning rearranging the pantry, not because it needed to be done, but because I needed something to do. The groceries were supposed to arrive at noon, but the delivery notification came an hour late. I was irritated at first, standing by the door and tapping my foot as if that would make the driver hurry. But when the doorbell finally rang, the frustration melted away. When I opened the door, there he was, Ethan. He was balancing 2 large bags in his arms, his face slightly flushed from the effort. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, flashing that familiar easy smile. There was something so disarming about him, so unassuming, like he belonged to a simpler world untouched by the weight of responsibilities. I tried not to stare as he handed me the bags, but there was something in his eyes, something warm and attentive. For years, I had been accustomed to quick glances, distracted nods, and half-hearted exchanges. But Ethan's gaze lingered, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me feel seen. "You've got a lovely garden," he said, gesturing toward the roses lining the driveway. His voice was casual, but it caught me off guard. When was the last time someone had noticed the garden? When was the last time I had stopped to notice it? "Oh, thank you," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "I planted those years ago, but I suppose I've let them grow wild. They look perfect just the way they are," he replied, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if he was still talking about the roses. I stood there longer than I should have, clutching the grocery bags and feeling the strange warmth of his words settle over me. Eventually, he gave a polite nod and walked back to his truck. I closed the door, but my hand lingered on the handle, my thoughts swirling. It wasn't anything, I told myself. Just a kind young man doing his job. But as I unpacked the groceries, I found myself smiling, a small, private smile I hadn't felt in years. From that day forward, I started to notice the way I anticipated his visits. It was subtle at first, a glance at the clock, a mental note to freshen up before the delivery time. I wasn't doing anything wrong, I reasoned. It wasn't like I was dressing up or trying to impress him. I just didn't want to look neglected. The next time he came, he remembered my name. "How are you today, Mrs. Reynolds?" he asked as he handed me the bags. His tone was polite, respectful, but there was something about the way he said it, like he actually cared about the answer. "I'm fine, thank you," I replied, my words feeling automatic. But deep down, I wasn't fine. I hadn't been fine for a long time. Over the weeks, our exchanges grew longer. Ethan would ask about the weather, the garden, even the book I was reading that he spotted on the table once. I found myself sharing little bits of my life with him, things I hadn't even shared with Mark in years. It wasn't anything personal, just small, safe details. But with Ethan, it felt different. He listened. One afternoon, after a particularly rough morning, Mark had left the house in a hurry. Barely saying goodbye, I answered the door feeling disheveled and out of sorts. Ethan noticed immediately. "Rough day?" he asked, his tone gentle but concerned. I hesitated, unsure why I felt the urge to confide in him. "Just one of those days," I said with a weak smile. He nodded, as if he understood more than I had said. "Well, I hope it gets better. You deserve a good day, Mrs. Reynolds." The simplicity of his words caught me off guard. It wasn't the kind of forced pleasantry people say out of obligation. It felt real, like he actually meant it. I thanked him, and as he left, I realized my chest felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted, if only for a moment. That evening, I caught myself thinking about Ethan more than I should have. Not in a romantic way, at least, that's what I told myself. It wasn't about him, not really. It was about the way he made me feel, noticed, appreciated, like I wasn't just fading into the background of my own life. Mark came home late again that night, distracted as usual. He barely looked at me as he grabbed a plate of leftovers from the fridge. I sat across from him at the table, the silence between us louder than any argument. "Did you have a good day?" I asked, trying to bridge the gap. "Same as always," he muttered without looking up. And just like that, the conversation ended. But in the quiet of that moment, I couldn't help but think of Ethan. The way he smiled, the way he said my name, the way he seemed to notice things that no one else did. I knew it was dangerous, this growing attachment, this spark I couldn't quite put out. But the truth? I didn't want to. For the first time in years, I felt alive, and I wasn't ready to let that go. The days seemed to stretch longer now, but not in the empty, monotonous way they used to. It was different. There was an undercurrent of something I hadn't felt in years, excitement, anticipation. And that terrified me. I told myself it was harmless. I was just being friendly, nothing more. After all, Ethan was young enough to be my son. This wasn't about him, it couldn't be. But still, every time I heard the doorbell ring, my heart betrayed me, racing like I was some giddy teenager. It was a feeling I didn't know I missed until I felt it again. The warmth in my chest, the slight flutter in my stomach, it was ridiculous, really. I was a grown woman, a married woman. And yet, I couldn't stop myself from lingering by the window on delivery days, watching for that familiar truck to pull into the driveway. The guilt came in waves, sharp and unrelenting. Every time I caught myself smiling after Ethan left, I'd feel a pang of shame. What was I doing? What was I feeling? Mark's presence at home became a cruel reminder of the emotional gap between us. He was always distracted, glued to his laptop or his phone, his conversations with me clipped and obligatory. I tried to bridge the distance, I really did. I'd ask about his day, his work, but his answers were always the same. "It's fine," he'd say, without looking up. Sometimes I wondered if he even noticed me anymore. If I disappeared one day, would he even realize I was gone? One night, after Ethan's visit, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed unfamiliar, her hair streaked with gray, her skin softer, her eyes duller than they used to be. I used to be beautiful, I thought. Mark used to tell me I was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. But somewhere along the way, those words stopped coming. Somewhere along the way, I stopped believing them. And now, here I was, holding on to fleeting moments with a delivery boy who probably didn't think twice about me after leaving my doorstep. It was pathetic. But as much as I hated myself for it, I couldn't deny how alive I felt in those moments. When Ethan smiled at me, when he asked about my day, it was like he saw something in me that I thought had disappeared long ago. I started noticing the little things I was doing differently. I'd pick out nicer blouses to wear on delivery days, something a bit more flattering than the baggy sweaters I usually wore around the house. I even started wearing lipstick again, a soft coral shade I hadn't touched in years. Every time I caught myself doing these things, I'd shake my head and laugh bitterly. What was I doing? Ethan wasn't paying attention to those details. He was just being polite, doing his job. But then, there were moments that made me wonder. One afternoon, as he handed me the grocery bags, he paused. "That's a nice color on you," he said, his voice casual but kind. I felt my cheeks flush. "Oh, thank you," I murmured, my heart pounding in my chest. It was nothing, just a compliment. But in a life where compliments had become so rare, it felt like everything. The worst part wasn't the feelings I had when I was with Ethan. It was the way I felt when I wasn't. When Mark came home that night, I could barely look him in the eye. He greeted me with his usual distracted tone, asking about dinner and work schedules. And for the first time in years, I didn't answer. Instead, I found myself wondering, if I told Mark how I felt, about the loneliness, the longing, the invisible cracks in our marriage, would he even care? Would he even notice? That night, as I lay in bed next to him, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying Ethan's smile, his words, the way he made me feel like a person again. I hated myself for it. But at the same time, I couldn't stop. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that I was just projecting my loneliness onto Ethan because he was kind to me. But the more I tried to push those thoughts away, the stronger they became. I started avoiding Mark, not intentionally, but because being around him made the guilt unbearable. Every time he looked at me, I felt like he could see right through me, like he knew what I was thinking. But the truth was, Mark didn't notice anything. He didn't notice my silence, my distant stares, the way I flinched when he reached for my hand. And that only made it worse. I knew I was standing on the edge of something dangerous. I knew I had a choice, to pull myself back or let myself fall. But every time Ethan showed up at my door, every time he smiled at me or asked about my day, it felt like a lifeline. It wasn't love. It wasn't even infatuation. It was something deeper, something more complicated. It was the feeling of being seen, of being valued, of being alive. But at what cost? Every interaction with Ethan brought me closer to the line I swore I'd never cross. And every night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I wondered how much longer I could keep lying to myself. The next time Ethan came to the door, I felt that same anticipation bubbling beneath the surface, but I told myself to keep it together. It was just groceries. A routine delivery. Nothing more. But when I opened the door, his smile immediately erased every rational thought I'd tried to cling to. "Afternoon, Mrs. Reynolds," he said warmly, balancing the bags in his hands. "The roses are looking even better this week." I laughed softly, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "Well, thank you. I've been spending a bit more time in the garden lately." That was true. For the first time in years, I'd been pruning, watering, and even talking to the flowers like they might bloom brighter if they heard my voice. Ethan shifted the bags into one arm and gestured toward the garden with his free hand. "You've got an eye for beauty," he said, glancing at the clusters of red and yellow blooms. "Most people let their flowers wilt in this heat, but yours are thriving." There was something in his tone, not flirtatious, not inappropriate, but deeply genuine. It was the kind of sincerity I hadn't felt in years, and it hit me harder than I wanted to admit. I felt the corners of my mouth twitch into a smile. Well, thank you. That's kind of you to say. He lingered for a moment longer than usual, standing on the porch as if he wasn't quite ready to leave. I've been meaning to ask, he said suddenly, what's your secret? Is it just good soil, or do you have some kind of magic touch? I laughed, and for a moment, I felt like the version of myself I hadn't seen in years, the woman who used to laugh easily, who used to feel confident and light. If I told you, it wouldn't be a secret anymore, would it? Over the next few weeks, Ethan's visits became the highlight of my days. He'd ask about my garden, the books on my coffee table, even the faint smell of cookies that lingered in the air from my afternoon baking. He noticed everything, and that attention was intoxicating. I found myself lingering too. I'd open the door a bit wider, let our conversation stretch a little longer. I wasn't sure if he noticed the way I carefully picked out my blouse each morning, the way I'd dab on a hint of perfume before he arrived. It wasn't for him, I told myself. It was for me. But there were moments when I wasn't so sure. One afternoon, he arrived with an extra bag. A small, unassuming one that didn't look like it came from the grocery store. What's this? I asked as he handed it to me. He shrugged, his smile easy but a little shy. I was at a market last weekend and saw these. Thought you might like them. I opened the bag and pulled out a small bundle of seeds, wildflowers, the kind that spread quickly and bloom in every color imaginable. I noticed you didn't have any wildflowers in your garden, he said, scratching the back of his neck. Thought they might add a little something. For a moment, I was speechless. The gesture was so thoughtful, so personal. I felt my cheeks warm as I looked up at him. Ethan, that's so sweet of you. You didn't have to do this. I wanted to, he said simply, his eyes meeting mine. The moment hung in the air, heavy and charged. I felt something stir inside me, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. After that, things started to shift in ways I couldn't ignore. Ethan began lingering longer during his visits, his questions becoming more personal. Do you always stay home alone? He asked one day, leaning against the porch railing as I unpacked the groceries. I hesitated, the weight of his question settling between us. Most of the time, I admitted, keeping my tone light. Mark, my husband, he works long hours. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. That must be hard, he said after a pause. I shrugged, forcing a smile. You get used to it. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I wanted to get used to it anymore. It wasn't just the conversations or the small gestures that kept pulling me in, it was the way Ethan made me feel. He had this way of looking at me, of really seeing me, that I hadn't experienced in years. One afternoon, as I handed him a plate of cookies I'd baked, his fingers brushed against mine. It was a fleeting touch, barely more than a second, but it sent a jolt through me. Thank you, he said softly, his eyes locking onto mine for just a moment too long. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. You're welcome, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. As he turned to leave, I found myself watching him walk down the driveway, the weight of my emotions pressing against my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something I thought you might like, he said, scratching the back of his neck, a faint blush creeping up his cheeks. I took the package from him, my fingers brushing against his for just a moment too long. The paper was soft, slightly textured, and I could feel the edges of what seemed to be a book beneath it. You didn't have to do this, I said, my voice wavering. I wanted to, he said simply, his eyes meeting mine. You mentioned the other day that you loved gardening, and I saw this at the bookstore. It made me think of you. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The warmth of his words, the thoughtfulness of the gesture, it was overwhelming. I looked down at the package in my hands, then back up at him, my emotions tangled in a way I couldn't untangle. But then, the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway shattered the moment like glass. I froze, the blood draining from my face as I turned to see Mark's car pulling in. The engine cut off, and for the first time in years, he was home early. Is that your husband? Ethan asked quietly, his voice laced with uncertainty. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The fragile bubble I'd built, The one where I could pretend these moments with Ethan were harmless, that they meant nothing, had burst. And now reality was closing in fast. Mark stepped out of the car, his tie loosened, his face tired but alert. His eyes landed on us immediately, taking in the scene, me standing on the porch, holding the small, wrapped package, Ethan just a few feet away with his hands in his pockets. "Susan," Mark called out, his voice calm but tinged with confusion. I panicked, clutching the package to my chest like it might somehow shield me from what was about to happen. "Mark, you're home early," I said, forcing a smile that felt unnatural. "Yeah, I finished up at the office sooner than expected," he said, his eyes shifting from me to Ethan. "Who's this?" "This is Ethan," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "He's the delivery boy." Ethan stepped forward, extending his hand. "Nice to meet you, sir," he said politely, but there was a tension in his voice now, a hesitation that wasn't there before. Mark didn't take his hand. Instead, his gaze lingered on the package in my arms. "What's that?" "Oh, it's nothing," I said too quickly, my words tumbling over each other. "Just something Ethan brought for the garden." A book." The air between us grew thick, heavy with unspoken words. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly, his brow furrowing as he looked between the two of us. "A book," he repeated, his tone flat. "Yes," Ethan interjected, stepping back slightly. I noticed Mrs. Reynolds liked gardening, so I thought it might be a nice gesture." Mark's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something, accuse me, demand answers. But instead, he gave a short, sharp nod. "Right. Well, thank you for the delivery. I'll take it from here." Ethan hesitated, glancing at me one last time before giving a polite nod and walking back to his truck. I watched him go, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure Mark could hear it. As soon as Ethan drove away, Mark turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You want to tell me what's going on?" "Nothing's going on," I said quickly, my voice shaking. "He's just a delivery boy." He was being polite. Mark stared at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine like he was trying to find the truth buried beneath my words. "Polite," he repeated, his tone clipped. "Since when do delivery boys bring their customers gifts?" "It wasn't like that," I insisted, clutching the package tighter. "He's just a nice kid. That's all." Mark's eyes darkened, a flicker of anger flashing across his face. "And what about you, Susan? Is that all this is to you?" His words hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to tell him the truth, not the whole truth, but enough to ease his suspicions. But what was the truth? That I was lonely? That I'd felt invisible for years? That Ethan's kindness had filled a void I hadn't even realized was there? Mark shook his head, his expression hardening. "You're hiding something. I can see it." "I'm not," I whispered, but the words felt hollow, even to me. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked inside, leaving me standing on the porch with the package still clutched in my hands. That night, the silence between us was louder than ever. Mark didn't say another word about Ethan or the package, but the tension in the air was unbearable. As I sat in the living room, staring at the unopened book on the coffee table, I couldn't stop the tears from falling. I had crossed a line, not in action, but in emotion. And now, there was no going back. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the guilt I felt for betraying Mark in some unspoken way, or the realization that, even after everything, I still couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. The evening after Ethan handed me the gift was suffocatingly quiet. Mark didn't speak much, but his presence was heavy, looming over every corner of the house. I felt his eyes on me during dinner, the weight of his unspoken questions pressing down on me until I could barely swallow. He didn't say anything at first, just pushed his food around on his plate with the fork. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice sharp and low. "You didn't answer me earlier." I froze, my fork hovering midair. "About what?" I asked, though I already knew. "About him," he said bluntly, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "Why did he give you that gift?" "It's not what you think," I said quickly, my words tumbling over each other. He's thoughtful." He noticed I like gardening, and it was a nice gesture. That's all. Mark's expression didn't change. His eyes narrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. Thoughtful, he repeated, his tone laced with skepticism. Susan, delivery boys don't just bring gifts for no reason. So why don't you tell me what's really going on? There's nothing going on, I insisted, but my voice wavered. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the panic bubbling just beneath the surface. Mark leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. You've been different lately. I've noticed it. You're distracted. Distant. Is it because of him? I shook my head, but I couldn't meet his eyes. No, Mark. It's not. Then what is it? He snapped, cutting me off. Because it sure as hell doesn't feel like nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. I opened my mouth to speak, to say something that might diffuse the tension, but no words came. Finally, Mark stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You know what? He said, his voice cold. Forget it. And with that, he walked out of the room, leaving me sitting there alone with the weight of my guilt. The next day, I waited by the window at Ethan's usual time, but his truck didn't come. At first, I thought it was a fluke. Maybe he'd been reassigned to a different route, or maybe he'd called in sick. But the days stretched into a week, and there was no sign of him. I told myself it was a relief. After all, wasn't this what I needed? Distance? Space to sort through my emotions and repair the damage I'd done? But the truth was, the emptiness felt unbearable. Every time the doorbell rang and it wasn't him, I felt a pang of disappointment. And every time I felt that disappointment, I hated myself a little more. Mark and I barely spoke that week. He wasn't outright angry. He wasn't the type to yell or lash out, but the silence was worse. It was cold, calculated, and deliberate, like he was punishing me by withholding his attention. I tried to act normal, to pretend like everything was fine. I made his favorite meals, asked about his day, but his answers were curt, his tone distant. One night, as we sat in the living room watching the evening news, I mustered the courage to address the elephant in the room. Mark, I said quietly, my voice trembling, can we talk? He didn't look at me. About what? About everything, I said, the words catching in my throat. About us. He finally turned to me, his expression unreadable. What's there to talk about, Susan? You've made it pretty clear where your head's been lately. That's not fair, I said, my voice breaking. I've been lonely, Mark. For years. And you barely even notice me anymore. Mark's eyes flashed with anger. Don't you dare put this on me, he said, his voice rising. I work my ass off to provide for this family, and you're telling me that's not enough? I'm not saying that, I said desperately. I'm saying I need you. I need the man who used to hold my hand, who used to tell me I was beautiful, who used to see me. And what? He snapped. You found that in some delivery boy? The words hung in the air like a slap. I felt tears welling up, but I blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. It wasn't like that, I whispered. Wasn't it? He said coldly. Because it sure as hell looks like it from where I'm standing. He stood up, grabbing his keys from the counter. I need some air, he muttered, and before I could say anything, he was gone. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt oppressive. Mark didn't come home until hours later, and when he finally slipped into bed beside me, he didn't say a word. I replayed the past few weeks in my mind, over and over, dissecting every moment, every decision. I thought about the way Ethan had looked at me, the way he made me feel alive again. For a moment, I considered throwing them away, burying this chapter of my life before it spiraled any further. But instead, I set them down gently, unable to bring myself to let go. The cracks in my marriage were more visible now than ever, and I wasn't sure if they could be mended. But one thing was certain, the choices I made moving forward would define everything. That morning, after Mark left for work without so much as a glance in my direction, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in our bedroom. The sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting soft lines across my reflection, but all I could see were the years etched into my face. I studied the woman staring back at me. Her hair was neatly combed, streaked with gray that she hadn't bothered to dye in years. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, looked tired, hollow even. Her shoulders slumped slightly, as though carrying the weight of years she couldn't remember fully living. When did I become this person? I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of the question. But deep down, I knew the answer. It wasn't about Ethan, not really. It wasn't even about Mark. It was about me. It was about the woman I used to be, the woman who once laughed freely, who once dreamed of adventures, who once believed she was worthy of love and attention. Somewhere along the way, that woman had been buried beneath the routines of life, the expectations of marriage, and the quiet erosion of time. And Ethan? He was just a mirror, reflecting back at me all the things I'd lost. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling as I folded them in my lap. Was what I had done a betrayal? Was it infidelity, even if nothing physical had happened? I thought about the way my heart raced when Ethan smiled at me, the way I looked forward to his visits like they were the only bright spots in my otherwise monotonous days. I thought about the small gestures, the lingering conversations, the gift he had given me. They all seemed so innocent in isolation, but when strung together, they painted a picture I couldn't ignore. I had crossed a line not with Ethan, but within myself. I had allowed myself to crave something outside my marriage, to seek validation from someone who wasn't my husband. And that, in itself, felt like a betrayal. But then, another thought crept in, uninvited and persistent. Was it really all my fault? Mark and I had been married for 30 years, and in that time, we had weathered storms together. Financial struggles, health scares, the ups and downs of raising a family. But somewhere along the way, we had stopped being partners. We had stopped seeing each other as people with needs, desires, and vulnerabilities. Mark had always been a good provider, and for that, I was grateful. But provision wasn't the same as connection. He worked tirelessly, often coming home too exhausted to do more than eat and collapse on the couch. He had built a wall of busyness around himself, and I had built my own wall of silence in response. The cracks in our marriage hadn't formed overnight. They had been growing slowly, almost imperceptibly, over the years. And now, they were too big to ignore. I thought about all the times I had tried to reach out to him, subtly at first, then more directly. I thought about the nights I had dressed up, hoping he would notice, only to be met with distracted indifference. I thought about the conversations I had tried to start, only to be shut down with a curt, "not now," or a half-hearted nod. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped trying. The logical part of me knew that my feelings for Ethan weren't real. They were a projection, a symptom of something deeper. But the emotional part of me, the part that longed for connection, for validation, for something, didn't care. That part of me clung to the way Ethan made me feel, seen, appreciated, alive. It didn't matter that he was just a young man doing his job. What mattered was the spark he had reignited in me, a spark I hadn't felt in years. But was that spark worth the destruction it could cause? I thought about Mark, about the hurt in his eyes when he questioned me about Ethan. I thought about the trust that had been eroded, the fragile bond that was now hanging by a thread. I thought about Ethan, too, the way he had avoided our house since that day. Did he feel the tension? Did he sense the storm brewing beneath the surface? Or was he simply trying to create distance, to keep things professional before they spiraled further out of control? I stood up and walked back to the kitchen, where the small bundle of wildflower seeds still sat on the counter. I picked them up, turning them over in my hands, feeling the rough texture of the twine that held them together. This tiny, thoughtful gift had caused such a ripple in my life, and yet it wasn't the seeds themselves that mattered. It was what they represented: attention, thoughtfulness, care. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, the weight of my emotions pressing against my chest. I needed to make a choice, not just about Ethan, but about myself, my marriage, my life. Could I repair the cracks in my marriage? Could I bridge the gap that had grown between Mark and me? And, even if I could, did I want to? I thought about the vows we had made all those years ago, the promises to love and cherish each other through all of life's challenges. Somewhere along the way, we had both failed to live up to those promises. But did that mean we couldn't try again? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between guilt and longing, between the past and the future. I placed the seeds back on the counter and stared out the window at the garden, the roses blooming brightly in the afternoon sun. They were beautiful, even in their imperfections. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for me too. I stood there, staring out at the garden, the wildflower seeds resting on the counter behind me, and I couldn't help but wonder, how did it come to this? How did a simple knock on the door unravel everything I thought I knew about myself, my marriage, my life? Ethan wasn't the problem. He never was. He was a spark, a fleeting reminder of something I had lost, but the fire that had been ignited came from within me. It wasn't about him. It was about me. But where does that leave me now? Standing at a crossroads, unsure of which direction to take. Do I try to repair the marriage I've spent decades building, even though the foundation feels cracked and unsteady? Do I confront Mark, share with him the depth of my loneliness, my longing, my need to feel alive again? Or do I let it all crumble, step away from this life that feels more like a shadow of what I once dreamed it would be? And Ethan, what role did he play in all of this? Was he just a kind soul who happened to cross my path at the right time? Or did his presence awaken something in me that can't be ignored? These questions haunt me, and I don't have the answers. Not yet. But maybe you do. If you were in my shoes, what would you do? Would you call it a harmless moment, a small, fleeting connection that didn't mean anything in the grand scheme of things? Or was it something more? Something deeper, more significant? Do you think I've already crossed a line I can't come back from? Or is it still possible to pull myself back, to rebuild the pieces of my life and my marriage before it's too late? I know I'm not the only one who's ever felt this way. I know there are others out there who've stood at this same crossroads, faced with impossible choices. So I want to hear from you. What would you do if you were me? Would you fight for your marriage, even when it feels like the spark is gone? Would you try to rediscover the person you used to be, the person you've lost along the way? Or would you walk away, knowing that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to start over? I'm not proud of the choices I've made, but I'm sharing my story because I know I'm not alone. We all have moments in life that test us, moments that force us to confront the deepest, most hidden parts of ourselves. So tell me, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know if you've ever been in a situation like this, or if you know someone who has. I want to hear your stories, your advice, your honest opinions. And if this story has resonated with you, if it's made you think or feel or reflect in some way, don't forget to like this video. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, real, raw, and unfiltered tales of the human experience. Because life isn't black and white. It's messy, complicated, and filled with moments that challenge everything we thought we knew about ourselves. Thank you for watching, for listening, for being part of this journey. I'll see you in the next story. As I stood in the stillness of my kitchen, staring out at the garden bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The moments that seemed so small at first had grown into something so much bigger, something that forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding for years. It's easy to point fingers to assign blame. I could say it was Mark's fault for pulling away, for letting our marriage drift into a quiet, emotionless routine. I could say it was Ethan's fault for being too kind, too attentive, for noticing me in ways I hadn't been noticed in years. But the truth? The truth is that the cracks were always there. They had been forming for years, little by little, until one day, they were impossible to ignore. What I've learned is that the most dangerous temptations don't come from the outside. They don't knock on your door wearing a kind smile and carrying groceries. The most dangerous temptations come from within. They come from the parts of ourselves that feel unseen, unfulfilled, unworthy. They come from the loneliness we bury under busy schedules, the longing we silence because we're afraid of what it says about us. Ethan didn't create the emptiness inside me, he simply held up a mirror to it. He reminded me of what I'd been missing, of what I'd stopped fighting for. And while his presence may have sparked something, the fire was mine to control, or let burn out of control. As I look back on the moments that led to this, I realize how fragile human connections are. They're like the flowers in my garden, beautiful but delicate. They require care, attention, and effort to thrive. And when you neglect them, even unintentionally, they wither. Mark and I had let our connection wither. We had stopped watering the garden of our marriage, stopped tending to the roots that held us together. It didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, so gradual that we didn't even notice until it was almost too late. But here's the thing about a garden: even when it looks barren, even when it seems like there's no hope left, it's possible to bring it back to life. It's possible to replant, to nurture, to grow something new. I don't know what the future holds for me and Mark. There are no guarantees, no promises that we'll find our way back to each other. But I do know this: the only way forward is honesty. Honesty with him. Honesty with myself. I need to tell him how I've been feeling, how lonely I've been, how invisible I've felt in my own home. And I need to listen to him too, to understand the ways I may have let him down, the ways I may have built walls between us without even realizing it. Because if there's one thing this experience has taught me, it's that connection is worth fighting for. Love isn't something that happens to you, it's something you choose, something you work for every single day. Susan's story, my story, isn't unique. It's the story of so many people who wake up one day and realize they've drifted from the life they thought they'd have, from the person they thought they'd be. It's a reminder that we can't take our relationships for granted. Love doesn't thrive on autopilot. It requires effort, attention, and vulnerability. So, if you're watching this and you feel even a flicker of recognition, take it as a warning. Don't wait until the cracks are too big to fix. Don't let the distance between you and the people you love grow so wide that it feels impossible to bridge. And if you're feeling unseen, unfulfilled, or lost, don't look for answers outside yourself. Start with the hard questions. Ask yourself, what am I missing? What do I need? And most importantly, what am I willing to do to change it? Ethan's kindness was a gift, not because it was romantic or because it filled a void, but because it forced me to see myself clearly for the first time in years. It reminded me that the life I want isn't out of reach. It's just buried beneath the routines, the silence, and the fear of being honest. And Mark, he's not perfect. Neither am I. But maybe perfection isn't the point. Maybe the point is to keep trying, to keep choosing each other even when it's hard, even when it feels easier to drift apart. So, if you've stayed with me until the end of this story, thank you. Thank you for listening, for being part of this journey, for letting me share something so deeply personal. I want to leave you with this. What do you think it means to love someone, not just in the beginning, when it's easy, but through the years, through the challenges, through the moments when it feels like love is slipping away? If this story has made you think, if it stirred something in you, please share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your stories, your struggles, your triumphs. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These are the stories that remind us of our shared humanity, that help us see ourselves and each other more clearly. Because life is messy, love is complicated, and we're all just trying to figure it out, one day at a time. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next story.